very, very warm welcome to our next speakers, to Chris Dercon and to Jacques and Pierre. Now, Jacques and Pierre spoke yesterday at the press conference. We spoke with Jacques about the kind of curatorial premise of this pavilion, the collaboration with the artists, the rule of the game. This morning we wanted to do at the beginning with Herzog de Meuron a panel and also Bernard Lassus on Lucius Burckhardt. And when we discussed, you said that there should be a third chapter which would be about preservation. I'm very, very delighted that Chris Dercon is with us today. Curator, art historian, filmmaker, many, many dimensions to Chris's work, currently the director of Tate Modern. But the connection to Herzog de Meuron is not only the building, of course, of Tate Modern, but it's also the Haus der Kunst. It's a much, much longer dialogue which Chris has had with Herzog de Meuron over many years, and particularly in relation to preservation, very, very important conversations at the moment of the Haus der Kunst in Munich. So maybe, Chris, you begin.
Thank you. Don't forget that this was a unique dialogue because it was not only Pierre and Jacques, we also involved, and it was a collaboration and a dialogue with Rem Koolhaas. And what's left from that dialogue about how to reconstruct this temple of Nazism is a plaquette, is a maquette, which we probably will never manage to publish. But the questions, I can assure you, the questions and answers asked in that maquette, how to reconstruct this expression of a Nazi regime, has been for me utterly inspiring. The connection with what's happening here is maybe the following. Cedric Price, he is of course incredibly known because of the preservation of his archives, but he also said very clearly that if a building is not anymore of use, it should be demolished. And I wonder what Jacques and Pierre think about this. If a building is not anymore of use, it should be demolished.
Well, I think it's a very modernist statement and a provocation. We could say exactly the opposite. You should never destroy anything. You should always somehow try to reuse it. And I think the reason why we have this talk here about, you put it in the context of preservation, the kind of real reason was because we just did a book about our armory project, which is a preservation project, but much more generally spoken, it is about how to deal with what is existing, pre-existing. And we have very European roots in saying that whatever we do and wherever we are, there's always something around us that we have to deal with. And I think that's a more interesting question than, let's say, particularly spoken, this or that building and the concrete approach to how to reconstruct, rebuild, renovate, reuse, or totally destroy it. I would never sign a statement like this. And I think Lucius Burckhardt, who is the reason why we sit here, was, of course, very hesitant when it came to physical activity, and even more when it was about taking things down, because his whole background, his whole history was exactly the opposite. So in that way, Price and Burckhardt represent totally opposed standpoints.
You always have been interested, Jacques and Pierre, to work with pre-existing buildings. And I believe that the very first project you made, which fits into this biennial about the elements, fundamentals, was the extension or the reuse of an attic room of a mansarde. Can you tell something more about this project, which maybe was like a manifesto for what you're still doing today, which is a combination of different approaches, which is restoration, renovation, reconstruction, extension, and I would also say, but we can talk about it later, contamination. Could you talk a little bit about your attic room?
Maybe manifesto is a strong word, because at that time we just were ready to do different kinds of interventions in a city or in a building. So it was not only the idea of having to do something new as young architects, so to do a manifesto, and this is now blue, or this is now has a pitch roof, or something else. But it was more to understand that interventions in a city can be of a different kind. And this was certainly not like we listened or we wanted to literally take Lucio's words, make a minimal intervention. That was not our intention at all. You know?
But the ideas...
But it just came to happen that we were asked to do this. And yes, we said, yes, we want to do this, even if it is only like an intervention, a small intervention, which is almost not visible in an attic.
Could you say that the ideas, the questions asked by the sociologist Lucius Burckhardt influenced this first intervention? That you were not afraid to do this? That it gave you courage? That it inspired you to do this?
Because it was also to have another attitude or another approach to the urban and architectural question rather than modernist architects like the great masters who wanted always to create big building. And certainly Lucius was sharpening our awareness to also other possibilities and not only to do like the big gesture, the big tabula rasa, the big gesture with a big knife.
Mm-hmm.
I think, Chris, we should open it up a bit more generally. Well, your initial statement about Cedric Price, why did he say that you should take down a structure? It was a provocation, but also somehow it's interesting that he wants to make room free for new things, for new activities, for humans. And with the same idea, Lucius said we have to keep stuff. Our attic, I think we learned a lot, on using the existing. So it was also a good lesson for us, what is a brick, what is all these stupid things. But I think more generally spoken, we should say what is for architects today, not only in Europe, because worldwidely, things are there, also people, cities, contexts. And we should not overly fetishize, or how do you say, the existing. In this, for instance, this wonderful brick wall has something, a material, central quality that we all love. So somehow we would all be tempted to leave that and reincorporate it in a later building. And now there's a small gap between respecting this and giving it a new value and making it into a fetish, which is in the way of something new. So from that point of view, I'm totally in line with Price and take this shit down and open up new ways. But on the other hand, to give it the value in that you discover something, hey, there is such a great value in something, respect that. Mm-hmm. So that makes everything more complex and more difficult. And architecture is difficult, mm-hmm. because it has all these many things that we have to judge and deal with. Mm-hmm. And that's why it's far beyond preservation. It is, what do we do with existing opinions, or existing structures, etc., etc.
And that's fascinating because, the two projects which I think are so relevant for this discussion, it's this project, Chris, you mentioned about the Haus der Kunst, and then the Armory, which is the subject of this book, Jacques and Pierre mentioned at the beginning, and somehow, obviously, one of the things I was wondering is that in both of these cases, you got to remember, Chris, at the moment of Utopia Station in Munich, we had many, many conversations, and you told me that, can one have a fun palace, actually not build it from scratch, but can an existing structure, as found, become a fun palace? And in some kind of way, that's something also interesting in relation to the Armory, because the Armory is not the museum. There are, of course, these period rooms which are very preserved, and at the same time, which are very intimate, but then there is this big space where you can hang in all kinds of functions. It's a music venue, it's an art venue. It's actually, of all the venues in New York, the one which is most kind of fun palace. So I was just curious, it's a question to all of you, because here we have the fun palace of Cedric, and it was a kind of a ex nihilo, the idea to build it out of nothing. Can a fun palace happen in a structure as found?
For me, the most useful and challenging question when we worked with Rem Koolhaas on this charrette, on this Q&A, what can we do with the building of the Haus der Kunst, was actually the Haus der Kunst is a historical process. Any building is a historical process. And I think listening yesterday to Eyal Weizmann, who was inspired by a Lucian Freud lecture by Edward Said, saying to go back to the very original moment of a building in the name of authenticity, in the name of history, is an utterly wrong, asocial, selfish project. You have always to look at the historical process. And our discussion about where do we begin, where do we end at the Haus der Kunst, I think we found it even more interesting what happened to the Haus der Kunst, to the Nazi building in the 50s than in the 30s. Because in the 50s, there were all these trees put in front of the Haus der Kunst, which Jacques then called pubic hair, putting in front of the Haus der Kunst in music. Pubic hair in the front and pubic hair in the back. What also happened in the 50s is that, you know, all the swastikas were stripped and everything was painted white. Not a glossy white, but a broken white. At least there was this kind of affinity. So in looking for this moment of renovation is looking at an historical process. In terms of the armory, where did you look for which kind of historical process? Because the armory is something which has to do with the building of the United States and the image of the East Coast, but also there is a public shelter for women. So where do you begin? Where do you end? Where do you start in the middle of something?
Where we started is, of course, when we first had the first encounter with the building. And the first encounter with the building was not even asking first when was it built, why was it built, and so on. This came later because we wanted to dig into this history, because you have still to dig into the history. But the first thing that we saw were the cables, you know, because it was just the headquarters of 9/11 and it just moved out. The Secret Service and the army, they just moved out of this building. And this was like the reality of that building at that time, and that was the impression. And of course, knowing that you can't keep that, of course. Even if you think it's a strong impression you have, you cannot keep it because the building has to be transformed and brought over to another use.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I think in the case of the armory, just like in the House of Kunst, it's very comparable that what has been added in the course of history is very psychologically interesting and telling about the change. You know, history is not just that it's 100 years back or 200 years and that you have to discover a concrete layer that you want to bring to the fore, you know, because it's renovation is also about the sheer impossibility to bring time back, and that's probably what Eyal was meaning. And what we also found out, because for instance in the past, when these rooms, these wonderful historic rooms in the armory were built, there was gas light, there was no electricity, and so you can really not bring that back. But nevertheless, somehow it's a wish of the client, and also we understand that you want to scratch off layers that were there, so you destroy something and reveal, let's say, the early Renaissance rather than the Tudor style. That's a decision. You destroy something. But we also try to leave other traces. Mm-hmm. And then we also try to not put one thing against the other, like the 60s did, like Scarpa, who is still a hero with many architects. We didn't want to go this way to say, this is new, that's what we did, and that's what was there. Who cares? At the end of the day, it has to be a good space. It has to be a space where now contemporary art is happening, balls are happening, even the police is going in. But let's say this approach is at least something we can discuss and is not based on an ideology. Because the Americans, for instance, have a totally different approach. They see history as something concrete that was like this. And you have to simulate that just like you fix the breast of a woman or lips or whatever. It's like freezing an image that was never really there. This is impossible.
Right.
And you mentioned the woman shelter.
Yes.
Which of course was very important, as this gives this building like another dimension. So it's not just to keep a building and to bring it to another use, let's say cultural use, so that would be just culture, 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 but you have also this other level in New York, which we know with the many homeless that they have, and to keep this on top of it gives to this building a much stronger identity.
Social identity.
Yes.
Now, talking about social identity, there is a problem. Yesterday night, Columbia published this little booklet, which is accompanied by a text which Rem Koolhaas started to think about in 2004. Preservation is overtaking us. It's a comment on this text and everything which followed by Jorge Otero Pailos. At the same time, yesterday night came this book out, a very critical book about the World Operational Guidelines for the implementation of the World Heritage Convention, because that we know that UNESCO has a problem. They lost 80% of their subsidy, which is their American money. UNESCO cannot do anything anymore for preservation, basically nothing. We lost so many buildings in the past 2 years, think about Syria, so we are losing many buildings, and at the same time we want to preserve everything. The funny thing about, I mean the sad thing about what we can read here is that the moment between construing, designing a building and preserving a building is getting immensely short. Already we can talk about prospective preservation. So my question to you both is, preservation today is in a crisis because it has to do with economical defaults, social defaults, aesthetical defaults, law-making defaults. Can we still preserve everything?
No, of course we cannot, and we lose a lot. Yesterday we spoke about forgetting, you know, and fight against forgetting. And also the main pavilion that Rem is proposing is about lost traditions somehow. This is an eternal issue in architecture. And tradition, in fact, was established, was the only condition architects had and societies had, not to forget, for instance, how to do a door, how to do a corridor, how to do a window. Now it's forgotten because we have so many informations, we have so much information, but not traditional information. And because this is lost, everything is lost. Now this can be seen as something good or something bad and give a value to it. And preservation is about giving a value to given things that exist and that we want to keep back. I would be very relaxed in this. How much we can keep and how much we want to keep depends on money. And if there is less money, there is less preservation. And that's how it is.
That's a pragmatical attitude.
Yeah, I think it's the only way, you know, we should give up ideologies and feel sad about this and that. I think it's more of an attitude to respect things if you are in a position to deal with something. Mm-hmm. That's more an attitude how you personally can act today as an architect, but also as a non-architect. That would be my take on this question.
Yes, but again, I think we cannot just give principles forever. I could bring another example in Munich, like 5 Höfe. The first project was to demolish almost the whole block and to come up and to all the architects to come up with new buildings. During the planning process, we as architects, as main architects, but also the client and also the political leaders, they understood that you couldn't just a few years or a few decades after World War II just tear down the 50s. But it was not that we thought the 50s were better than something else. It has more to do with the public memory. And to demolish this one generation later would have been a very difficult moment.
Right. In the book about the armory, which was published by Birkhauser, you keep saying, at least in 3 instances, what we are doing is not preservation in the traditional sense. What do you mean by preservation in the traditional sense? And what could then give a new sense, a new meaning to preservation?
Well, it is, I don't know whether we exactly said in the traditional sense. It's rather different methods or different approaches to preservation. I don't like the word preservation. We never use the word preservation. I think there are other words like reconstruction, because sometimes you reconstruct, sometimes you renovate, sometimes you simulate. So I suggest that there's many ways to bring back what was there and to bring in new things. And as I said before, the amerikanische Denkmalpflege, they have a very clearly defined approach. And that is what Pierre mentioned, that is more or less like a fixed approach. That we are rejecting because every space and every physical condition you find in such a building or in an urban context is different. And so it's an ongoing kind of a process, just like the history was a process.
But also, one thing which I thought was interesting, if we use it as a word, preservation or not, I mean, one of the things which I think both in the Haus der Kunst project of Chris and Rem and Herzog de Meuron, and then in the Armory project is present, is this sort of negotiation between, something Pontus Hulten always said, which you have in every cultural institution, a negotiation between it being either time storage or a lab. And it seems sometimes that it's almost impossible to be both. However, exciting institutions are both. And so in some kind of way, I mean, it's particularly struck me or keeps striking me in the Armory, because here you have this central room in the Armory, which is, one week there is a Riprese display for Stockhausen, and it moves, and that's very fun palace. Another week there is a, Gesamtkunstwerk, a total installation by an artist, and then the next week is Macbeth, in some kind of way. And that's, and then you have these period rooms, which are almost like a museum, but there can also be conversation rooms. But so there is this tension. I suppose in the Haus der Kunst as well. Can you maybe, all the three of you, say something about it?
I would like to come back to the tension which is happening here, because I'm struck by the fact that this is an ideal mix between a lab and a time storage. And I would like to clarify that by the following example. I never seen the approach to two architects dealing in such a clear way with the difference which Walter Benjamin made already in the 30s, in 1935, between architectural drawings, plural, and architectural drawing. It's very interesting with this approach which you and Hans-Ulrich initiated with Tino Segal, that suddenly we start to understand a medium which was lost almost forever, which is architectural drawing. And there is such an interesting difference between the way Price and his colleagues approach it and the way Lucius Burckhardt and his followers approach it. And then you go to the Japanese pavilion and you have this small box room which is called the blueprint room. And I was thinking, why is there, since Henri Lefebvre, because he was one of the last, I think, why was there not a kind of, not remake, but a kind of rethinking about what architectural drawing can do and what architectural drawings are, or what the drawing of architecture is? How did you approach this subject when dealing with the incredible, rich image archive of Price and Lucius Burckhardt? Were you ever interested in what architectural drawing is, or the drawing of architecture?
Well, I think that the drawing as a means or a tool of expression remains a strong and very fast tool. I mean, we often say to the younger people in our office, use sketches and drawings to express faster than you would do with a machine. Because of course technology continues to evolve, and one day you can have sketching machines. But as long as the computer needs to be used to then produce a plan, the plan tends to be too perfect. And what we like about the drawings of Lucius and also Cedric Price is, and this is very much how we use the drawings, is like Hans-Ulrich, this is all, sorry to show that, is human, natural, easy, fast ways to connect the thinking with the communication of the thinking. I think that's a very important lesson. And I'm sure it remains important in the future.
And it's a very direct way between your eyes, your brain, and to visualize something. And it doesn't make it also so definite. That's because you can have a different interpretation of it than someone else.
Right.
So this this field of interpretation is closer to drawings, to hand drawings, than to like the technical drawing.
It's interesting because, you know, we are talking about elements, fundamentals, and maybe we should in the future again think about architectural drawing, the drawing of architecture, architectural drawings as a kind of fundamental which we should revisit. Can we revisit quickly Lucius Burckhardt, because we started to say that Cedric Price said, you know, when a building is not of any use anymore, it can be taken down. Did you find in the image archive, in the drawing archive of Lucius Burckhardt, any comic strip, any photo collage, any comment, any gesture, any question about preservation? Does it make sense in Switzerland?
No, but what he certainly disliked is that preservation is freezing something. That was certainly, he was against this all Denkmalpflege stuff that was raising and getting more important in the 60s and in the 70s. So this was never his approach to protect things. On the contrary, he was always in the transformational aspect of life, but also of cities, which is part of life, were always in the foreground.
Jacques?
Yeah, I totally agree. On the other hand, his roots were really old Basel Protestant family, so he was rather on the conservative side. You know, he was also co-founding the Green Party, so he had a very ecological approach to things, and I think there's an interesting ecological thought in the idea of preservation. You know, and that certainly was close to his heart. So I think we turn a bit around. I think that we both, you know, or we all share this idea also with Rem on Haus der Kunst. I think he's also someone who's torn back and forth between, of course, preserving and giving back a certain value versus, you know, maintaining too many things, you know, and blocking paths for the future. But the path for the future in the mind of Burckhardt were social, of social nature, much more than of formal nature, you know, to keep things, because he believed that, like the Armory for the shows that you're co-curating, like the Tate, like Haus der Kunst are old structures that proved to be really great today.
There could not be a better conclusion. It also, with the Green Party, brings us back to Joseph Beuys, his drawings, his co-founding of the Green Party, your beginnings with Joseph Beuys, the drawings in the exhibition, and obviously the entire exhibition here started with these comparative studies of Lucius's drawings and Cedric's drawings, and actually many parallels we discovered, that also that sense of humor plays a big role they both had. Thank you so much, Chris, Jacques and Pierre. Thank you, thank you. C'est bien? Très bien. Merci beaucoup.